You were surrounded by people. That's what makes it so hard to explain. Not alone in your apartment, not isolated, not without anyone to call. You were in the middle of a conversation, or a dinner, or a room full of people who by every reasonable measure care about you. And the loneliness was there anyway. Quiet, specific, and completely out of place given the circumstances. And because it was out of place, you probably didn't say anything. You smiled at the right moments. You contributed to the conversation. You stayed until it was reasonable to leave. And then you went home carrying something you couldn't name. This particular kind of hollow that has nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with something that didn't happen in that room. Some contact that didn't get made. Some version of you that was present but not seen. And if you've felt that, not once, not occasionally, but as a pattern that keeps repeating across different people and different situations, this video is going to explain something that most content about loneliness never gets close to. Because the standard conversation about loneliness is about quantity, about having enough people, enough contact, enough social activity. And what you're describing has nothing to do with quantity. It never did. Here's what it's actually about. Why the standard explanation misses it completely. The conventional framing of loneliness treats it as a deficit of social contact. You're lonely because you're isolated. The solution is more connection, more people, more interaction, more time spent not alone. And for a specific, simple kind of loneliness, that framing is accurate enough. If you're geographically isolated or going through a period of genuine social scarcity, more contact does help. But the loneliness you feel in a room full of people is immune to that solution because it's not produced by the absence of people. It's produced by the absence of something specific that people can be present without providing. And no amount of additional social contact addresses it because the contact itself isn't the variable. What the research in social psychology and attachment theory actually points to is a distinction that changes the entire frame. There are two fundamentally different experiences that get called loneliness, and they have almost nothing in common except the name. The first is social loneliness, the absence of a social network, of enough people, of regular interaction. And the second is existential loneliness, the absence of felt understanding, of the experience of being genuinely known by another person rather than simply being in their presence. Social loneliness responds to more contact. Existential loneliness does not. You can be socially saturated, surrounded, included, constantly engaged, and existentially lonely in a way that the social activity not only fails to fix, but sometimes makes worse. Because every interaction that stays on the surface is another data point confirming the gap. Another room where the real version of you didn't quite make it into the conversation. If this distinction is naming something you've felt but never been able to articulate, hit the like button. Because getting this right changes everything about what the situation actually needs, where it comes from. This is the part that tends to matter most. Because existential loneliness, the kind you feel in a full room, doesn't arrive randomly. It develops through a specific process, and understanding that process removes the shame that makes it harder to address. The most common origin is a long history of learning that full self-disclosure is not safe. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, not necessarily through obvious rejection or cruelty. Often through something much quieter and more pervasive. The accumulated experience of bringing something real to a relationship and having it met with something that didn't quite match. A deflection. A subject change. A response that answered the surface of what you said without touching what you meant. The advice when you needed acknowledgement. The humor when you needed to be taken seriously. The reassurance when what you actually needed was for someone to sit with you in the difficulty, rather than immediately trying to remove it. None of those responses are malicious. Most of them come from people who genuinely care about you and are doing their best with the emotional vocabulary they have. but repeated often enough, across enough relationships and enough years, they teach you something. They teach you that the full version of what you feel and think and experience is more than most people can meet. So you start editing. You bring the version of yourself that is easier to receive, more manageable, more likely to produce the response that doesn't leave you feeling more alone than before you spoke. And the editing works, in the sense that it prevents the specific disappointment of bringing something real and having it missed. But it produces its own cost. The loneliness of being with people who only know the edited version, of being liked, even loved, for something that is real but incomplete, of smiling at the right moments, because the real moment isn't something you found a way to bring into the room yet, the villain you didn't choose. Here's something worth naming directly, because it sits underneath a lot of what we've described, and it doesn't get acknowledged nearly often enough. The capacity for deep connection, for the kind of interaction that actually addresses existential loneliness, requires a specific set of conditions that the culture most of us grew up in is remarkably bad at producing. Speed, efficiency, the optimization of every interaction for productivity or entertainment, the social norm of keeping things light, keeping things positive, not burdening people, being easy to be around, the unspoken agreement in most social contexts that a certain depth of honesty is inappropriate, that certain feelings are too much, that the appropriate response to "how are you" is "fine, thanks." Those norms are not neutral. They systematically prevent the kind of contact that existential loneliness requires, not because any individual is failing, but because the social architecture itself is built around a kind of interaction that prioritizes comfort over depth and surface over substance. You've been trying to feel genuinely known inside a system that is not designed to produce that experience, and the conclusion most people draw from the failure? That they are somehow too much, or not enough, or fundamentally difficult to connect with, is exactly the wrong conclusion. The system was the problem, not you. Save this video. Because what comes next is where this shifts from explanation to something you can actually do differently. And the framework is one you'll want to come back to the next time you walk out of a room carrying that specific hollow feeling. What the loneliness is actually asking for. Here's what tends to reframe things. Existential loneliness is not a sign that connection is impossible for you. It is a sign that you are capable of a depth of connection that your current relational diet is not providing. The longing is evidence of the capacity. You cannot miss something you have never been able to imagine. But the fact that you know the difference between being in a room and being actually met, that you can feel the gap between presence and contact, means you have experienced something closer to the real thing at some point. And your nervous system has not forgotten what it felt like. The work, then, is not to want less. It is not to lower the standard until the existing connections feel sufficient. It is to create the conditions, carefully, gradually, in the relationships that have the most potential, for deeper contact to become possible. That begins with something that feels counterintuitive, when the dominant experience has been the edited self becoming the default self. It begins with selective disclosure, choosing one relationship, one conversation, one moment, and bringing something slightly more real than you normally would. Not everything at once. Not a flood of everything you've been holding back. Just 1 degree more honest than usual. 1 layer closer to what you actually think, or feel, or mean. And then watching what happens. Not hoping the other person will immediately match it, but noticing whether they move toward it or away from it. Whether the real thing, when it appears, is met with something that makes the next disclosure slightly less costly. Over time, that process, slow, imperfect, requiring more patience than it should, is how the edited self gradually becomes less necessary. How the full version of you finds its way back into the room, the thing most people never realize. Here is the watch-through insight, the one that tends to stay past everything else, because it reframes the experience in a way that changes what you do with it. The people who feel this kind of loneliness most acutely are almost never the people who are least capable of connection. They are the people who are most capable of it. The sensitivity that makes a surface-level interaction feel hollow is the same sensitivity that makes genuine connection, when it happens, feel profound in a way other people don't always access. The capacity that makes you aware of the gap is the same capacity that, in the right conditions, makes you the person someone else feels most truly seen by. The loneliness is not evidence of a deficiency. It is evidence of a depth of relational need that most social environments are not designed to meet, and that most people never develop the courage to bring directly into their relationships. All the people who eventually stop feeling it are not the people who stopped needing depth. They are the people who found 2 or 3 relationships where depth became possible, not dozens, 2 or 3, and built their relational life around those, deliberately, rather than continuing to seek the feeling of genuine connection from contexts structurally incapable of producing it. That is a smaller project than it sounds, and a more important one than almost anything else. The psychology of what makes genuine connection possible, the specific conditions, the attachment patterns that help or hinder it, and what it looks like to build toward it from inside a history of feeling unseen, goes deeper than one video can do justice to. There is a video on this channel that gets directly into the attachment patterns most commonly underneath this specific kind of loneliness, where they formed, how they shape the relational patterns you're currently in, and what building towards something different actually requires. That is the next layer of this. And if today named something you have been carrying for a long time, following that thread is worth more than you might expect right now. If this loneliness has been significant and sustained, if it has been shaping how you move through your relationships and your daily life in ways that feel heavy, please speak to a mental health professional about it. What we have described today is real, well understood, and responds to the right kind of support. You do not have to keep navigating it alone, which would be its own particular irony. Drop a comment with the specific situation where it hits hardest. Not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary ones. The dinner, the party, the conversation that went fine, the room you left feeling more alone than when you arrived. Those responses tell everyone watching that the geography of this loneliness is remarkably consistent across very different lives. And that consistency is the beginning of feeling a little less alone in it. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.